What some surmised, but no one would admit, was that not only did my father abuse me physically and try to dominate me mentally, but he also molested me sexually throughout my childhood. Our father was traumatized as a World War II bomber pilot, sent home with what was then called war fatigue. He suffered flashbacks and nightmares for the rest of his life. After the war, he married, resumed amateur boxing, and his work as a salesman driving back and forth from the far north across the great central desert to the south of Australia, selling supplies and wine along the way. My father believed that his name meant hidden, holy, reborn prince. This belief, combined with his peculiar religious zealotry and the fact that he was one of only a few members of his squadron to return home alive, led him to the conclusion that he was an unrecognized prophet, if not a messiah.
You here, I've chosen you to tell you this. In Exodus chapter 19:20, it clearly states the penalty for such an offense is death.
Though I didn't share this view, his sense of omnipotence had been so branded into me as a child that it was hard for me to believe him capable of dying. And when my sister told me that he was indeed near death, I had the unexpected impulse to return to Australia. Soon after I was born, our father gave up his traveling work and moved us to a farm near Eden Valley. Very early in my life, I became aware that his goal as a parent was to sire a boy, and that as girls, we were a disappointing substitute, a prelude to the real thing. That this was so baffled and challenged me, and what our father sought in his relationship to me repulsed and confused me. We were isolated on the farm. The only people I saw beside my family were the occasional water drillers, the once-a-year shearers, wool classers, and grape pickers. I hung around these people fascinated and hungry for the wide world beyond the surrounding hills of the Barossa Valley. Our father changed religions like some people change their cars, and so there was always another secret doctrine to be learned and the previous one to be repudiated. Whatever he said was intended to be indisputable, and any opinion distinct from his own was a sin against his absolute authority. I was known as the black sheep of the family because of my outspoken defiance. Because I defied him, he strove to beat the devil out of me, coming upon me at random with the sticks he kept ready behind every door. I learned to escape into the paddocks and draw, and to hide inside the great gum trees that the Aboriginal people had hollowed out with a slow-burning fire. Hiding in these tree shelters, I felt the collective presence of the Aborigines who had once lived on these lands, surrounding and including me. And I began to identify with all those who are mistreated. I remember scrubbing the walls of the shower, wanting to clean away something terrible, to disinfect, to erase. I did erase. His prayers were answered with the birth of a boy. In school, we were taught about empire and the divine right of kings. Only a boy could feel so entitled. I was often ill, so when I learned that the Spartans left sickly girl children outside to die, I determined to steel myself to survive and live to be as strong as Queen Boadicea, never taking into account the unfortunate demise she met for all her courage. To fulfill our father's dreams, we were encouraged to become Olympic athletes and to smile on demand before his camera. Our father felt he had psychic powers. He recorded our movements on film in notes, in ways that to us seemed normal. It was all we knew. "I know where you are at all times," he'd say. One night, I was left alone with my father. I escaped him and ran out into the night, first trying to sleep on my horse, and then hiding in the dog kennel while he prowled around in search of me, snapping his switch against his leg. If caught near his desk, I'd be made to spend hours pinned like an insect.
I've chosen you to tell you this. These monsters, I say that because they're demon-possessed. The Lord says in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, you get this punishment or you get that blessing. You get this punishment or you get that blessing.
The 10 deadliest snakes in the world are all found in Australia, and I reckon they all lived on our farm. To Dad, snakes weren't just quarry, they represented evil. Hadn't a snake in the Garden of Eden been the ruin of us all, the devil incarnate? Weren't we by some stroke of destiny living in Eden Valley? An army marches on its stomach. Get the picture, lass? Anticipating Armageddon, he prepared a bunker in an old well, stored food and ammunition. When I was 6, I wrote my first anti-war poem in response to his combat training. "Over here, lass, I'm not finished. There's not much time, see? The world's getting ready to blow itself up." I remember looking out over the land, loving it, the way some people love their mothers, and saying to myself, I've got to get out of here. All my life, it seemed, there was the drought creeping down from the north, threatening to engulf us. In time, the paddocks were bare, the sheep had to be hand-fed. He'd stand there like Hitler before the crowds and cry, "Do you love me? Eh? Do you really love me? Eh?" It went on like this until he'd split the sack of sheep nuts and let them feed.
It says, "I am the Lord, I change not." It's still the same God. Look around at the curses we've got. Blighting the nation with an evil curse.
I wanted to be like David, strong enough to resist Goliath. But David went on to become a king, and all I got was bruises. Nature was my refuge, my consolation, my pleasure. When he sold the farm and moved the family to the city, I lost the ground beneath my feet. I lost the nurturing nature gave me. I lost for a good while myself. The year I turned 13, we moved into a house in the city of Adelaide. There was no place to hide or escape from him. He was more violent, he stalked me on the street, put bars on my windows, was obsessed with the thought of me being in contact with boys. When I telephoned my friends, I could hear him breathing on the other phone. Over and over he beat my head against the wall until I lost consciousness. Here, there were neighbors to consider. He smothered my screams by pushing a pillow over my face when he beat me. I was defiant. He was brutal. I went out of my body like a zombie. I hid behind a deadpan expression and a mask of makeup. I wrote poetry and I fought him. "You were a difficult child," my mother told me. "Why didn't you report him?" I asked her. "Oh, at that time, it wasn't required by the law. I did wonder what he was doing all those hours in your room with the doors closed." Convinced that he would soon kill me, I ran, first finding shelter with friends, then, after reporting to the authorities, temporarily staying in another friend's home. Realizing he could no longer stifle my screams, my father had a nervous breakdown and checked himself into a psychiatric hospital. My mother weathered all this with a strange indifference, replacing fact with fantasy. As her husband wrestled with a nervous breakdown, she was making arrangements to have her daughter locked away, and all the while counting her blessings, because that very week she was one of the finalists for the Housewife of the Year. Though I had committed no crime, I was incarcerated in a Magdalene laundry run by nuns, using the slave labor of young and troubled women. Surrounded by concrete, I was unable to commune with nature. I had never known such loneliness. The nuns forbid the use of my name. I chose another and was baptized in disinfectant. There, among others less fortunate than me, I was forced to accept the unacceptable, the complete loss of freedom, and the totally circumscribed existence. Forced to work with the thunderous, sometimes hand-crushing machinery, treated as defiled, I buried my defiance deep inside. I tried to die. Encouraged to discontinue my education, I insisted that because I was only 14, education was my right. I was allowed a few hours off from work in the laundry to complete a correspondence course. Briefly, a kind old woman supervised my studies. I was so used to the nun's condemnation that her acceptance amazed me. She affirmed my right to hope with a strengthening sureness, and she was gone. After my release, I felt tarnished, branded, alien. I told very few, believing that those who had not experienced such things could not understand. Again, I turned to art. I won a scholarship and chose to go to art school. My parents separated. A prolonged divorce case followed. My father, wearing my innocence as his own, tried to disparage me. They discussed my private parts in open court. I was numb. I sought family among friends, questioned authority, and wanted to overturn the world with my bare hands. By the end of my 17th year, I'd saved enough money to leave Australia. I went as far away as possible, participating in cultures radically different than my own. I read, wrote poetry, and painted portraits of people as a way of communicating beyond language. After stopping in Malaysia, I worked in London, hitchhiked all over Europe, traveled to Morocco, the Soviet Union. I crossed the Atlantic and worked in New York City. I experienced flashbacks and disabling headaches. There were great blanks in my childhood recollections, flinching responses to certain movements, pain stored in my muscles, the horror of remembered smells. I traveled across the U.S. and settled in San Francisco, where I ran a restaurant and continued my art and studies. But no matter how far away I went, somehow he'd locate me, and on birthdays I'd be awoken in the night to hear him alternate between dirty jokes and religious diatribes. I harnessed my art to my sense of injustice, immersing myself in international causes for human rights. I married a fellow artist but was reluctant to have children. Instead, I defended the disenfranchised, protested greed. Eventually I had to confront myself as the first place to bring about change. I saw that the hate I felt towards my father was poisoning me and decided to release it. I led art workshops for marginalized adults and children. I felt more at home with them, loving and recognizing their gifts. But the very hardest thing was to have compassion for myself. I divorced and lived for a time in Istanbul, teaching art and studying the mystic poets. Back in New York, I moved my studio to a mountaintop surrounded by nature, where I paint and write my way to freedom. What a face. Got a perfect face for this kind of thing. Now,
You look amazing.
don't make a After many years, my sister phoned, telling me our father had had a stroke and death was near. I feel compelled to return to the bottom of the world. And there he is. I try not to touch or be touched by him, to stay in my body. He's rasping on about killing a male nurse and saying that if Adam lived to 900, why can't he? My sister and I go to the house where he's lived alone since the family split. Having turned his guns and ammunition into the police, we reclaim our old photo albums, my drawings, poetry, our diaries. In his sock drawer we discover old letters addressed to me that he had intercepted, and postcards from the investigators he sent to locate me in my travels. In the margins of the transcript of the long divorce case, there are notes in his handwriting. Some strive for a motor car. I strive for a virginal 12, 13, or 14-year-old. The mind is deceitful and desperately wicked. And then we find the films he'd taken when we were growing up. He begins whispering a blow-by-blow description of a battle during the Napoleonic Wars. My sister is vomiting in the bathroom, and I'm straining to hear, hopeful, not of apology. He's incapable of that, but for some clue to help me understand. But since my time's limited also, I interrupt and demand he return to the present and look me in the eye. This he does with great effort, and I see that his steely, ball-bearing eyes are a little wondering, like a baby's. You've always wanted freedom for yourself, I say, but when I was young, you felt you could suppress me and violate my freedom. How injurious that was. When his eyes stray, I call him back, acknowledging the anguish he must have experienced. When you meet the guardian beings at the gates of death, I say, they will likely be composed of all your wrongdoings. I hope you won't fight them. He already had his dukes up, but instead will find compassion for yourself. He appeared to take this in. As we left, his parting words were, "This is my story, alas, alack. Once you squeeze out the toothpaste, you can't squeeze it back." He hung on and died on Good Friday, just to make his point. On Easter Sunday, we had a creepy feeling he might be back. I feel released. Then I determined to put this film together, to speak the unspoken. As long as child abuse is hidden, it isn't identified, and what is not uttered is not challenged. If it had all never happened, I'd have never left, and if I hadn't left, I wouldn't be here.